So yeah, so welcome guys. Hi, come on, no worries. Yeah, welcome. Welcome to the Embodied Social Cognition Lab. I'm really excited to have you guys join us. And yeah, we do a lot of things in this lab so that require a secondary pass in terms of research. So what I mean is, when you actually run a participant, you collect all this data from them, but what we actually analyze and use in order to conclude, make conclusions on our hypotheses are numbers, right? We can only work with numbers when it comes to statistics. So as a result, we have a lot of data that is not currently numerical, and we need you to help us create numbers from human behavior. So what that means is we have a number of coding tasks that we're going to ask you guys to do over the course of this semester. There's going to be a lot of video coding. So what that is where you'll watch, say, a social interaction that was recorded in our lab. You won't be told the hypotheses of what we were testing while you're coding, just because we don't want that to, bias what you perceive. But we'll always tell you the results of what you get, and all of that, once you're done coding, we'll tell you all of that stuff then. But that's fun because you watch the behaviors, and then you'll fill out essentially a survey that's like, how engaged was this person? How cooperative was this person? How much do you think they liked their partner? And stuff like that. In many cases, it's subjective, but you'll be surprised at how quickly that subjectivity kind of converges. But another big thing we do in this lab is collect psychophysiological data. And so we also need to turn that into numbers. So we have, this is an example physio file that you guys will see. And we collect all sorts of things, and they're in these pretty waveforms, more or less, depending on the quality of the data. But we can't really take the picture and infer any meaning out of it. What we need is to identify key points on each of these waveforms that actually represent bodily events that are occurring under the skin, if you will. And then from that, we have numbers, and then we can analyze it. So what I'm going to be teaching you guys today how to do is to score the physiological data. And then when you're doing video coding, and also, you'll also be doing some content coding where you'll read people's responses and just sort of categorize it and stuff like that. Those things you'll be trained on specifically for the specific project, because that'll be more, specific to what is needed at that time for that particular project. But with physio data, it's an overall skill that you can learn, and once you learn it, then you can do it in apply that knowledge to almost any data that we collect in this lab. So that's what I wanted to do today. But I wanted to start off with just sort of everybody introducing themselves. Hello. So I'm Liz. I am the director of the Embodied Social Cognition Lab, and you guys are now all undergraduate researchers in the Embodied Social Cognition Lab. So Julian is our lab manager, and he is like the man in charge. He knows everything. So if you're wondering about something, Julian probably knows the answer. And he's also in charge of, allocating or assigning people to projects and all those kinds of things. So Julian is like the heart that makes this lab work, or the brain. Actually, you're probably the brain. The executive control center. So yes, so Julian, definitely get to know him. So what I'm going to teach you how to do today is to score 3 measures that are really interesting to us as psychologists. So the first thing I'm going to teach you how to score is ECG, which is just the electrical activity of the heart. So from that we can get heart rate, and as you'll certainly see while you're going through files, people's heart rate might be a certain at a certain rate during what's the baseline period, but then once they start, say, doing a speech task, then all of a sudden their heart will speed up quite a bit. And from that first pass of scoring ECG, that gives us a lot of really interesting information. But you always score ECG first, and then we'll use what you scored in ECG to then extract 2 other measures. So we're also interested in, from the impedance scoring, which will be the second thing I'll show you how to do, how to extract what's called pre-ejection period. I'm going to say all these things multiple times because it's a lot. But pre-ejection period is the time between when your heart beats electrically and when it ejects blood out into the body. Now, this is simply just measured in milliseconds, how long it takes. That being said, it's a direct measure of the sympathetic nervous system, which is the neuroendocrine stress axis in our body. So when people are really engaged in a task and they care about performing well, then you'll see a strong change in pre-ejection period. Specifically, the pre-ejection period will get shorter. So the time between when your heart beats electrically and expels the blood will decrease. So people who are interested in motivation, for example, are really interested in this measure. But I'm more interested in the underlying branches of the autonomic nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic response, which is captured by pre-ejection period. So that's the second thing I'll show you how to score. And then the third thing I'll show you how to score today is what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, or RSA. And this is a measure that uses respiration as well as heart rate in order to determine the activity of this other branch, the parasympathetic nervous system, that many people call the rest and digest nervous system. But essentially, when you're chilling out and all you're not in a stressful state, then you'll have very active parasympathetic activity. Whereas when you're in that engaged stress state, then usually parasympathetic activity is pretty low. Now, from our perspective, the reason that I find the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches to be so interesting is because, well, the sympathetic nervous system is related to motivation and performance, but the parasympathetic nervous system, there are theories that it has evolved along with the complexity of social groups across animal species, such that we think that the parasympathetic nervous system is fundamental in social coordination and communication. So what we want to do with the data files that we get is determine how active people's parasympathetic nervous systems are while they're, say, interacting with a stranger, someone new, and how does that then translate into how effectively they're able to decode that person's emotions or perceive that person's personality. So these are the questions that we're asking through these measures. So that's what I want to show you how to score today. So I'm going to start off with a general introduction to Acknowledge. So this is a computer program that is installed on these computers and definitely all of our lab computers. And it's also in BV491. But also talk to Julian because we can just give you, our install disk. Because everybody who's a student of mine, in my research lab, are allowed to use it. So Acknowledge is a bit of a finicky program, but once you start working with it for a while, you'll get used to its quirks and then it won't seem as crazy. But as a very broad introduction to Acknowledge, you're always going to have sort of tools along your top row here. And the tools that you're going to end up using a lot are going to be this bar cursor, which is this guy here. Also, this zoom tool will be helpful for zooming in and out on things. And then these two guys here you'll use a lot. So these are where you'll, the event marker tool, which is where you'll actually be able to select what type of events you're identifying on these waveforms, and then be able to click on the graph and insert them. And then finally, this guy, which looks like the event flag, except it has a little lightning bolt through it, deletes events that you don't want. So When you're working through the file, you'll use this top row of icons quite a bit in order to select different tools. You can mostly ignore this for now, but I will say that here is your measurement bar, and you'll see in your scoring manual that we need to select certain things from the measurement bar. So they come with a certain set of defaults, such that what we really care about, or basically when you click on one of these things, it shows you all these different metrics that Acknowledge will extract automatically from whatever channel that you see down here is currently selected. And you'll see when going through the scoring manuals that Julian has circulated that there are certain measurements that you're going to have to select depending on what analysis you're currently doing. So he sent around 3 scoring manuals, and what I'm going to do is essentially walk you through a demonstration of what those manuals say, but then when you're actually scoring, you should pull up the manual and follow it step by step, because you'll see there's a lot of words, but if you actually read them and then do exactly what it says one by one, then you'll find that, that you're able to score right away. They have been a little bit pilot tested by other people too, so at this point I think at least the ECG and impedance manual is pretty good. So let's, oh yes, one other thing I should say, even though I kind of gave a hint here, is that Acknowledge reads in different physiological measures, and of course it depends on what we've actually applied to the skin. Most of our data files that you get will have 6 channels, although we don't necessarily care about all of them. But the channels we care a lot about are these top 3. The one labeled ECG, this other one here, this is the electrical activity of the heart. So every time you see a little like jagged spike here in the ECG wave, that is a beat of the heart, and I'll get into that in more detail. This is a waveform that doesn't have much meaning just by looking at it. This is your Z0 line. But this channel here is the first derivative of Z0 over time. So derivative as in from calculus, it's looking at the slopes of this line. And so what this value means here is the amount of blood that's circulating in your torso. Or sorry, that's the sort of y-axis here. So every time you see an increase, that means that there is a surge of blood in the torso. Now, why would there be a surge of blood? It's because you notice that the heartbeat precedes the peak on this line just a little bit in time. So your heart beats electrically and it contracts, and then pre-ejection period is that time in between the electrical beat and the contraction, and when your left ventricular valve, which is the one that connects to your aorta, opens up and expels blood out into the whole body. So in that moment, there's this surge of blood in the torso, but then very quickly it gets spread all to your arms and legs and everywhere else in your body. So that's why you see this beat of the heart, and then about a tenth of a second later, you see an increase in the blood volume in the torso, but then that ends up falling as your blood gets spread out to your extremities. You guys will also probably score, although I won't teach you how to do it today just for time's sake. You'll also learn how to score PPG, or photoplethysmograph. What this is a measurement that's on your fingertip, and it measures the amount of blood that you have in your finger. Now, the reason we're particularly interested in this is because we're interested in both how much blood is present in your finger as well as how long it takes for the blood to get to your fingertip, given how much we know when the surge of blood is in your torso. So if you notice here, although this isn't the best sort of vertical resolution, but if I do something like that, you can see it a little bit better. If you notice, say with this wave, we have the beat of the heart, then you see the increase of blood in the torso, and then you see the peak for blood that's present in your fingers. And it's just following the natural way that blood is moving through your body. And the reason why this is psychologically interesting is that when you're in a state of physiological threat, as we call it, your whole body, all your cardiovascular system constricts, and it conserves blood in the core. Which is adaptive in some situations, but it actually inhibits your cognitive and physical performance. So since we're really interested in capturing that state, we measure a pulse plethysmograph so that we can see just how much vasoconstriction people have versus dilation. And then this is skin temp. We always measure it, but I swear I've never even scored it in my entire life as a psychophysiologist. But you could, if you thought it was interesting for some reason. So we'll mostly ignore this channel. And one day, if somebody has a question that can be answered with finger temp, they'll come back for it. But I will say just a little, piece of trivia is that I think the most interesting thing about finger temp is that for the most of the day, your finger temp slowly rises, but approximately 3.5 hours before you start to feel subjectively sleepy, your finger temperature turns around and begins to steadily fall. So, so people, I mean, I don't think there hasn't been direct science that tests what I'm about to say, but you can do finger temp measures just very easily with any kind of thermometer essentially, or a way to measure your skin temp. So some people have said, oh, well, what you should do is when you start to notice your skin temp falling, like drink coffee then, and then you won't get tired, in 3.5 hours. But that's kind of the most interesting thing that comes from skin temp. And then some people are really interested in GSR. I tend to be less so. But what this is down here is the skin conductance of your fingers. And so at any given point in time, your skin conducts electricity more or less. And the amount that it conducts electricity reflects your sympathetic nervous system, or essentially that sympathetic stress response. However, it's a more specific measure than pre-ejection period, which I previously said is our pure measure of the sympathetic response, where what GSR captures is specifically sort of the aspect of your stress response that has to do with motor movement. So if somebody is really sympathetically engaged or stressed, and they have a plan to act and move their body, then you'll see activity in GSR. But if you're really stressed out, but your brain isn't telling your body to act in any way, then you would see a change in pre-ejection period, but not in GSR. So sometimes we will score GSR if we want to sort of differentiate between a stress response, the pure stress response, or the subset of the stress response that's focused on motor action. So these are the things that we tend to collect in this lab. So with that introduction, I'm going to start with scoring ECG. The first time that you set up Acknowledge on your computer, you're going to need to set up certain presets. So when you're on a Windows computer, which you guys are, if you go to the display menu, then there will be one of the options there will be preferences. And if you have a Mac and you download the Mac version, then this is under the Acknowledge menu instead. But once you pull that up, then the main thing to do is make sure that the time units here are set to milliseconds and not this default option, which it will be the first time you use Acknowledge on a new computer. You don't want it to say that, you want it to say milliseconds. And this is in your file, or sorry, the manual. So you just make sure that is selected, and then the other things that we need to make sure we have when scoring ECG is that this first thing in the first item on your measurement bar is set to time. The second one is set to delta T, which stands for change in time or delta time. And then finally, the last one is set to beats per minute. And then you can delete, just turn these remaining ones to none, and this is all listed in the manual. So that's the main setup. Now, since we want to, now I'm going to start talking about actually scoring ECG. Although I should also say, like, please break in and ask me questions at any point. Yeah, because I'm just going to kind of go, but I want to actually make this useful for you. So, yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we want to score ECG. That's the first thing here. So in order to do that and to do it well, you want to be able to really see ECG. So I would recommend hiding all of these other 5 channels that you don't need right now. Now, in order to hide it, you'll notice up here in the measurement bar, it might be off to the right, it might be probably down below it. You see that there are each of these channel names or there are these numbers that when you click on them, if you notice, it highlights a new channel. So if you click on it while you're holding down the Alt button on your keyboard, which should be just a little bit to the left of your space bar, and you click on any of the channel numbers, instead of selecting it, it'll hide them. So that then you only have in view what you really want. And that's just a good way to do it well. And then one other thing I should say at this point is that you will become, zooming is one of the first, like figuring out the right time scale to see and like interacting with the level of zoom is going to be one of your first challenges with Acknowledge, because they have all these different ways to do it, and all of a sudden you'll be like, where'd my data go? So it's almost certainly probably there. With the zoom tool, you can either, once I select this thing, this little magnifying glass, if I click on the graph, it'll zoom in. And if I click and drag and create a box, it'll zoom just pretty much around where I have tried to focus it, right? If I want to zoom out, again, if you hold the Alt button and click on the graph, it'll zoom out. But now you notice it's really, the vertical axis is very squished, and that doesn't help you as much all the time. So whenever you feel that you want to, have a bigger view vertically, then you will go to the Display Auto Scale Waveforms option, which is also a keyboard shortcut of Control-Y, and that brings this into a greater vertical focus. So you'll end up doing these things a lot. And we're recording this session, so I expect you can come back here too and watch this a few times, because you will see that in the very beginning, it'll be zooming and dealing with that. That'll be your greatest issue. But as you probably guessed, that's not such a big deal. So once you get used to it, then it'll be no problem. Okay, so what are we doing? So with ECG, a classic ECG wave, unfortunately, this one has a little bit of noise in it, but that's just because in this case, well, we didn't have, the electrodes were a little dried out. So what you normally see with an ECG wave are a few key events. So we have the very spike or top peak of an ECG wave is when we consider the heart to have beat. I mean, truly, we could choose a number of points along this waveform, but we've just collectively decided that the top most, or the maximum value of electricity, which is what the y-axis is here, is when we say the heart has beat. So therefore, if we want to capture heart rate, then we need to identify all of these peaks. Now, the best way to do this in Acknowledge is to use their Find Cycles dialog. So you'll see what I mean in a second. So the first thing that you need to do is, when you're starting your ECG analysis, is scroll to the very beginning of the file, select the bar cursor, and click before the first beat of the heart that you see. And it needs, unfortunately, there's just a quirk of Acknowledge. You have to start here because it doesn't know how to go back to the beginning. So once you've clicked on the graph with your bar cursor before your first ECG wave, then we're going to go to the Analysis menu up here that's pretty much in the middle of my menu bar. And one of the options here will be Find Cycle. So once you click on Find Cycle, it says locate cycles from peaks, events, or fixed time intervals. Here, what we want the software to do is to identify every peak. So therefore, we want it to locate cycles from peaks. We tell it where to find the peaks, and it will just by default use whatever channel is currently selected. But if for some reason you just didn't have your ECG selected, you'd simply click on here and you could select from all the channels that are available. In our case, all of our peaks will be in the positive direction, but sometimes people just switch the lead wires and then the ECG comes in like flipped, and so that's why it has that option. But ours are always in the right direction. Here's the key thing. It's going to ask you for a threshold. What this threshold refers to is, oh wait, I realize I can't. Okay, what this threshold refers to is over here, the millivolt value above which it will look for peaks and below which it will ignore any peaks. So this is important because in a normal ECG wave like this, you have your P wave here, which is where your where your atria are depolarizing. Then you have your Q, which is right where your left ventricle depolarizes. Then it pops up to what we call the R spike or the QRS peak, down to what we call the S complex, and then up here, and then you see what's called the T wave. So this is like a beautiful ECG wave, but we only want it to identify the R spike. And Acknowledge on its own wants to call this a peak, and it wants to call this a peak, and any sort of little noise in between it also wants to call a peak. So we want it to not pay attention to any peaks that are below a certain millivolt value. So for every file, this will be a little bit different. So when you open up your file, you'll literally look just on your first, say first 8 seconds is fine, but you're gonna look over here for the axis for a value that you think most of the peaks will be above and most of the stuff you don't want it to notice will be below. So here definitely a value of 1 seems to have most of these peaks, and it's well above where the T wave goes. So I might just set the threshold to be 1 for now. But this will be a little bit different on every person because it depends on, well, a few things having to do with their settings as well as how the electrodes were placed and a number of other factors. So I've decided that I want it to look at a threshold above 1. So in analysis, find cycle, I still want peaks on the ECG channel that are in the upward direction, but I'm going to set this threshold level to be 1 millivolt. And then you click on selection, make sure that the left edge is previous peak. This is all in the manual step by step. And the right edge is current peak. Here are the edges that it's referring to is what's being selected or what are the periods that we're trying to identify. So we wanted to select every pair of peaks in there. So that's why we have the left edge of the selection be the previous peak and the right edge be the next peak. And the final thing to do is to click on the output option. And then under the output menu, there are 5 sort of sub-menus. For your first pass, you only want to click on the events menu because what we want Acknowledge to do here is to try its best to identify all the beats of the heart, and then we're going to come through and make sure it did a good job, and usually it won't be perfect. So I'm going to click or check the box that says Output Events. We don't want it to output an event on the left edge, but we do want to output an event on the right edge at the edge. Here's where next it asks you for the output type. So here is where we're going to say that we want it to identify, or when it places a mark on the right edge, that it's going to identify this as a QRS peak, or basically that R point, the top of the ECG wave. So you select from here, hemodynamic, again, this is all in the manual, which I keep saying only because I know it's a lot. But after you do a few files, you'll be amazed at how quickly you learn it. So hemodynamic, ECG complexes, QRS peak, and you select that there. The output channel here, you want to make sure that the output channel is the ECG channel so that you can, so that it's actually marking the events on the ECG waveform. And from there, that's all you need to change. Everything else in Find Cycles you can leave as its default, and then you click OK. Now, sometimes it will pop up a box that says, do you want to do Find All Cycles now? And you'll select yes, and that's what your manual tells you to do. I will say that I've been discovering over the last few weeks that Acknowledge sometimes doesn't do that, and instead you have to manually go to Find All Cycles. So what you do is you go to the Analysis menu, and under Find Cycle, 2 down is Find All Cycles. And so then you click that, and it'll run the auto scoring. So it's thinking. And so now it's done thinking, which is good. And so what you see now are these little QRS like labels at the top of every spike. And what you want to see is a QRS label, peak at the top of every spike, and you don't want to see a QRS peak, say, on one of these things, right? But Acknowledge it's just trying its best, but computers are notoriously bad at finding local minima and maxima. So after it's identified them all, you need to zoom through your file so that you can fix anything that was wrong. So here's an example of where something went wrong. So if you notice, we do have a QRS peak identified here, but it also put 2 right here. And that makes sense when you look at our time frame here. Basically, these were above our threshold of 1. So simply, what you need to do is delete those bad markers. So this is where you'll click on that event flag with the little lightning bolt through it, which means like deletion basically, or like zapping it. And when I've clicked on that, you notice that now that I'm hovering over the graph, I have this little lightning bolt tool. And so if you click on the graph around the points you don't want, it makes them disappear. So then, after I've fixed that, I continue scrolling through. I see shortly after that we have this is probably movement artifact, but again, this is a beat of the heart. This is definitely a beat of the heart. These 2 are not a beat of the heart. Oh, there is something else I should say, I'm sorry. Is that with each person, you'll notice, we call this individual stereotypy, but you'll notice that every person has their own signature for their ECG wave, for example. Same with their impedance wave. And every time I hook up the same person, their ECG wave will look the same, even over the course of years, unless they have some kind of heart problem that occurs in the meanwhile. So as a result, when you're starting to score a new file, a new person, you really want to kind of burn in your brain what their ECG waveform looks like. So this is a kind of prototypical ECG wave where the downward spike that follows the upward spike is about equivalent in magnitude. But one very common deviation you'll see here is some people don't have much of a downward spike at all, not much of what we call an S complex. So it'll look more like this. And however, for that person, every beat of their heart will look exactly like that. So when you have messier data, and you've already burned in your brain or in your eyes, what this person's signature ECG wave looks like, that'll really help you to pick out, this is an ECG wave, this is an ECG wave, this is not an ECG wave, because it won't deviate at all this much from what you originally thought. So keep it on. You just click through. And what I'm doing actually, sorry, is I'm clicking on the zoom, the scroll bar down here. But I'm not actually clicking on, the little arrows. I'm actually just clicking further forward, because what that does is it advances it by a page at a time, and that helps. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mean if you, sorry.
Like if I just clicked on the QRS, that's the one that you want?
Oh yeah. That's a great question, because I'm not even sure if we'll have any missing here, and I need to show you guys how to do this. So let's pretend that, say, you either zapped a QRS peak, or that for some reason it wasn't picked up when you did your find cycle. So then what you need to do is insert a new one. So the way to do that is to go to this event flag tool, and you click on it and you hold it. And when you, as in don't let go, and when you click and hold, then you'll see this sub-menu appear. And now this menu is actually the same menu with the same choices as you used in Find Cycle when you were selecting what event to put at the right edge of everything. So if we go down to, so we want to add a QRS peak. So therefore, without lifting my left mouse button, I go down to hemodynamic, ECG complexes, and QRS peak. Just release to select that. And then I need to click on the flag one more time to actually select the event tool. Oh, except, sorry, I want to place an event, a QRS peak right here. However, in order to do that, I need to zoom in more so I can really see what is the exact maximum there. So this is where I would click on my magnifying glass first up here, and then draw a box, say like there, so that now all I see is this peak. I might even try to zoom in even more, like that. So once I can see this very nice, parabola, right? I want to put a marker right there, as much directly in the middle of that as possible at the maximum point. So again, I click on the graph now that I've selected the right event that I want, and I haven't let go of my left mouse button yet. And when I move it around, then I have this line that appears, and that will help you place it exactly where you want to, exactly in the middle. And so then I let up, and it puts a QRS marker or peak at that point. So if you accidentally delete one, then you just replace it. Or if you're going through and you find that Acknowledged didn't correctly find an ECG wave, then this would be how you replace it. So now we want to zoom out again. So I will click on this magnifying glass, and I'm going to hold down the Alt button while I click on the graph so that I can get, like, say, this many QRS peaks in there. Then I'm going to go to Display Auto Scale Waveforms so that I get a nice, I can see it all vertically again. And I'd continue on through. So we see, as we do, that there's more mess here. Just need to delete this. So the reason you're seeing what you're seeing is that when people move with ECG, it actually changes the baseline voltage of what's being recorded. So this is just movement artifact that creates this. But it makes it obviously more difficult for your computer to work with. So you scroll through, aha. Here's where it thought this was a beat of the heart, and it didn't get this one, which is definitely a beat of the heart. So zoom in. It remembers the last event that you chose. So since the last event that I had chosen from that menu was the QRS peak, I can just click right on it and it'll do that again. So I'm good. Zoom out. And keep on going. And so here's another missing one. Zoom in, insert my peak, and so forth. Let's see. So I'm going to keep going until I find one other example of common ways that Acknowledge messes up. And if I do, then I'll then I'll show you that, and then we'll move on to scoring impedance. But really, you're just reviewing this to double check the computer. But remember that humans have much better vision than computers do. And so it's really easy for us to look at the graph and know exactly when the computer messed up. But the computer doesn't have that level of introspection for itself. If you're into computer science, then it's actually this thing called the hill climber problem, where computers have real problems detecting these local minima and maxima, but that's what we need them to do for physiological scoring. So this is why humans are still the best physiological scorers and really the final control. All right. Zap. So this is pretty good. Okay. So we got to the end of the file, and indeed, I've decided now that everything looks good. We reviewed all of the markers, we got rid of the bad ones, we added some of the ones that were missed. So now you're ready to actually export your ECG data that you scored. So in order to do that, it's very similar to how you started. So you first select this bar cursor here, and you're gonna scroll all the way back to the beginning of the file to the first heartbeat, and make sure to click on the graph before the first heartbeat. And now we'll go back to the Find Cycle dialog. So it's under the Analysis menu, Find Cycle. And here's where we're going to change things up a bit. So before, we were asking it to first identify all the ECG or all the heartbeats from peaks. But now we have refined that by adding all of these events, all of these QRS peak events. So now we're going to select events instead. So it's going to ask what's the start event, and we're going to need to go to hemodynamic ECG complexes, QRS peak again, located on ECG channel. The end event should be the same thing, because we actually want it to identify every interval in between each heartbeat of the heart. So the end event will be hemodynamic, QRS peak, located on the ECG channel. So this is good. You will want to just double check your selection. So once you start scoring with on your computer, then this will save your settings every time. That being said, the first time you score this, there will always be some weird offset for these, and you just want to make sure that they're set to 0. But you want the left edge to be the time of the starting event and the right edge to be the time of the ending event, and you don't want any additional offset added to that. So just make sure they say 0. And once you do it once on your computer, it'll always save that, but you will have to do it the first time, or you'll be like, I don't understand why it's messing up. So then you'll click on your Output tab. Now, what we wanted to do is save measurements into an Excel spreadsheet. And then we'll say, open the spreadsheet after the cycle is found. In your manual, it'll point out that you probably need to click on averaging and make sure that this checkbox is unchecked, because it'll give you errors that you'll be like, I don't understand what's going on. And it's almost certainly from that. Or it'll say very specifically that there's not enough data for cycle averaging. So if you get that, it just means you forgot to uncheck this box. And it's no big deal, you just go back and uncheck it. Now finally, under the events, you now do not want it to output events anymore, because we want it to instead save this data to an Excel file. So you just make sure that is unchecked, and now you're good to go. So you click OK. This is the thing that it normally will say when it's not being finicky. And so you will answer yes. It says, do you want to perform find all cycles now? We did that manually essentially before. You just click yes. And when you do, it's going to think for a little bit. And then eventually it'll open up an Excel spreadsheet. Yeah. Yes, so it says it can't find any cycles. Yeah, it does that. So it might be that, oh no, you do have it at the very beginning. Okay. Oh, you know what I bet it is? Okay, so for some reason it says QRSE, which means QRS end. It actually doesn't matter that you marked it as the QRS end, but in your find cycle, you're going to want to make sure that it's the same one. So actually, if you go to analysis, find cycle, then yes, so instead of QRS peak, select hemodynamic ECG complexes, and then QRS end. And then do the same for the next one, and it should work at that point. Let me know if it doesn't. Yeah. Oh, that I'm not sure about the answer to that yet, but soonish. Yeah, because we're doing cool, post-processing of it. But then, yeah, Julian will circulate it as soon as possible. Yeah, thank you. Awesome, cool. Yeah. Aha, no cycles are found. So in this case, what if you scroll back to the very beginning, and because it does look like it pairs peaks, and with the bar cursor, click before your first peak there, and now go to analysis, find all cycles, and see if that works. No, it still doesn't. Okay, so now if you go back to analysis, find cycle. Right, that looks promising. Okay, now if we go to output, say measurements, what about events there? Okay, now try averaging, just to see if it's there. Okay, now click on selection. Try clicking find first cycle there. Okay. And now try find all cycles by analysis. Okay. Well, we're going to have to figure out what's up with that in a second.
There's no E and then we changed it to end, remember?
Oh, okay. It might be, if it's not exactly the QRS peak, then yeah, you need to identify the one of them. You know what? Another thing you can do is go to analysis, find cycle, and do all events, I think. So if you do start event, yeah, that guy, yeah, sorry. I wonder if you can do general. Sorry, if you click there, yeah. No. All right, so we'll figure this out in a bit. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Oh, no doubt. Yes, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. All right, guys. So usually there's all sorts of little things, and actually it's good because you'll come to notice that when you're scoring, there'll be many times where you're like, wait a second, it's not fully working the way it's supposed to. There's some things that you'll get really used to, and other things are quirks. Just as you're going, if you get stuck, take a screenshot of what you did or what you're getting, especially the error message. If you can remember the exact error message, and just email me, and then I probably will know what it is, and if not, then we'll just meet up and figure it out. But just in the beginning, expect that there will be little things, and don't worry about asking me questions because I expect such things. And so what you see here is in milliseconds, the time frame. We see delta T, the delta T column is the change in time from one heartbeat to the next. And so we call this interbeat interval. And this is actually what psychophysiologists usually use for heart rate. However, we also have beats per minute over here. So what we see when we kind of look at this participant's file is that they're pretty bradycardic, meaning that their average heart rate is probably around 62. And I mean, I don't know, I'm just guessing by looking at this. But that's pretty low. It wouldn't be bad, but in general, on average, men's heart rates are 70 beats per minute, and women's heart rates are about 75 beats per minute. But there are many reasons why people might have lower or higher heart rates. Like if they work out a lot, then they'll have a low resting heart rate in the low 60s usually. But yes, so this is your ECG data file, and this is what we want. These are the numbers that we will use in our analyses. So once you have this, you'll save your Excel file according to the conventions that are in the manual, but specifically, the way we do it is we add the type of analysis, that we just did, so ECG, and then with a hyphen, we just add that to the original file name. So in this case, this was Shirk 002 was the original file name. We're just sticking ECG in the front. Now I will say on these computers, there's a funny thing where I think it opens your data in protected mode, which is kind of obnoxious because it won't let you save it. So when that happens, if you are on these computers doing it, then just copy all, or Control A will select all, and then copy it and paste it into a new spreadsheet. But when you're on your own computer or in any of the lab computers, you won't have that problem. Okay, so that's ECG data right there. That's awesome. So we know how to score ECG. So I would, now that you have all of these events saved and everything, you want to save your work. Or actually, it's even good to do it before you start working. So I would save your data file with an identifier indicating what work you've done on it so far in the same place where you had already stored your other data, and probably where you store your the output Excel file. So now, I would save this work and essentially close it. Maybe I'll even go so far as to do that. But then, so that's scoring ECG, and you're actually done with that. That would be how you do it. But once we have ECG scored, then we can score impedance and also respiratory sinus arrhythmia. But you have to start with your scored ECG file. So, once you've scored ECG, then you want to essentially duplicate the file that you just created and save it as impedance, which, as it says in your manual, we refer to it with a ZCG. This is borrowed from physics, where they use the letter Z in order to represent impedance, or how much something resists electrical current. So we're just using the same abbreviation there, but it stands for impedance cardiography, essentially. So I'm saving this file in this way, and I'll open up Acknowledge again. So now I have my file, but with impedance, there are a few things to say. So for impedance, you're going to use your ECG channel, but also your DZ/DT, or that derivative of impedance, that third channel as well. Now, we actually are going to first need you to split your data file into 1-minute segments, and then you'll take an average of all the impedance waveforms for that minute and only score and identify the events once per minute. So this is described in detail in the manual, but I'm going to start off by showing you how to score, say, 1 minute of this, and we'll start by splitting the data file into 1-minute segments. So, in order to do that, you go to the display menu. We want to get what's called the selection palette to make it very easy for you to split this data file into 1-minute segments. So you go to the display menu, and then down towards the bottom will be a sub-menu called Show, and then way towards the bottom of that, you'll see Selection Palette. It'll be the second to last option, probably. So you release it, and then you'll see this thing pop up. Now, if you notice, there's this little arrow off to the side, and you can use that in order to set the time units. And since we want to divide the file into 1-minute segments, it's just easier if you make sure the time units are in minutes. So whatever, the selection tool will select any region that is between your left and right bounds here. So if I want to select the first minute of data, then I'll put 0 minutes as the left edge and 1 minute as the right edge. And now if we scrolled back in the file, you'd see that as soon as we get to 60 seconds, that's where the selection stops. So once it's selected, this minute time period, you can go up to the File menu, and you'll notice it says Save Selection As directly underneath Save As. And this is where you'll export only the selected amount of data to a new file. So the way we name these is by adding the minute number, which will be the whatever minute you put in the right edge of the selection tool. So since the first minute goes from 0 to 1, we'll put 1 here to indicate it's the first minute. I'm just adding it to the front of the file. And then you'll save that file on its own. I will say it's helpful to create like a folder just to hold all the files you create for each person, because otherwise you get a lot of, just for organization, but you can do it however you want. So the next thing, after that, you would go to change these numbers here in the selection palette to be the left edge is 1 minute, the right edge is 2 minutes, save selection as, export that as the second minute. Then you go to the third minute and do the same thing, and you do that for all. For the Shirk Physio, I think there's only 6 minutes in a data file, but for some of our data files, they're as long as 45 minutes. That's for IWH. But most of our files are actually 25 minutes. Okay, so you've exported the minute file. So I'm going to pull up that minute, but let's say that you did that for your entire file, so you now have all the minutes of the file in this folder. So now that I have my 1 minute data file, which you'll notice because if I scroll here, it only goes to 60 seconds. Now I'm ready to do the impedance analysis. So I'm going to close the selection palette because I don't need it anymore. Gesundheit. And then what we want to do, back in the day for impedance scoring, as in only about 10 years ago, people for every single beat of the heart would identify all these different points on the impedance waveform. But as you get into this, you'll see that that becomes very tedious, especially because for a, say, 25-minute file, you'll easily have 2,000 beats of the heart. So if you're putting, identifying 2 or 3 points for every single beat of the heart, that takes a long time. So now what we do instead, and to make things a little bit easier, is to ensemble or essentially average all of these waveforms together so you get a sort of typical waveform for that minute, and then we'll extract values based on that. So this is how we do it. You'll go to the analysis menu, and down near all the E's that are in this little group down here, you'll notice there's this ensemble average. It's not the last option, this is just a very long menu. But it'll be right under electromyography if you're looking for it. So we click on ensemble average, and it asks it first asks you where, should I create this average around? And so we want to say, do it around peaks, and do those peaks in the DZ/DT channel, because now we're really wanting to average this channel. So once you do that, you click OK, and it's going to pop up a little box that says, please highlight a single peak in the data and click peak is selected. It's referring to this button that has now suddenly appeared up here. So we'll say OK, and so what you want to do here is click somewhere on the graph where there is an impedance peak. I would choose like one that looks pretty, where you can really see this one local minimum. So let's say here. But you want to select really as little as possible. You want it to clearly contain your peak, but you don't want to do a big selection here, just because you really want it to identify this is a peak and not look for other little peaks around it. So I've selected only a little sliver here, and then I click peak is selected. It asks me, is the peak pointing up or down? Again, some people read in their impedance data upside down. We always read it in right side up. So for us, peaks are going up. Then it asks you which channels should be included in the average. And as it says in your manual, you only need ECG and DZ/DT. We make sure both of those are checked. Then you click OK. Now it says, please highlight the area around the peak to be included in a single averaging pass, and then click do average. So I'm like, all right. So now you notice that there's an arrow pointing to the peak that you had selected before. So now is when you want to make sure that you have a good range around it. And in particular, what you're going to be identifying on the ensembled waveform is what we call Q on the ECG wave, which is the last sort of point. It's usually a slight downward depolarization right before the R spike goes up. On the DZDT wave, you're going to be looking for the local minimum that is right before the peak of the DZDT wave goes up. We also want the second local minimum after the peak of the DZDT wave, and it's usually the lowest value, but not always, of the DZDT wave. So what this means, since we need to identify this point, and this point, we want to make sure that you select a big enough area such that it includes all of those points. So I'm going to start over here, so I'm well before the Q point, which would be like right about there where my cursor is. And I want to go far enough such that I'm probably past the X point, the second local minimum afterwards, which would be there. So I release my, my mouse button, and I'm satisfied with this area, and then I click Do Average. And it thinks for a little while. And then it's done. So this is the average of both of those waveforms for the whole minute. So now you can really identify the points on the wave that matter. So with the ECG wave, we want to identify Q. Which this is called QRS because we refer to this first point as Q. This is R, this is S, so QRS. BioPAC Acknowledge refers to this as the QRS onset. On the DZDT wave, we want to identify what we call B, but it's when the left ventricular valve opens, and it's the middle of the local minimum right before we increase to the max. And then the second minimum, probably right here, after the DZDT wave goes down, is where the left ventricular valve closes. And so this we just denote with the letter X. And these are the 3 points that you want to identify here. So in order to do this, you actually have to select the right tool or right event flag from the event flag menu, and unfortunately you're gonna have to do this every time. It's kind of a pain in the butt, I think. But so let's start with Q, or the QRS onset, and that's still like before when you're selecting QRS peak. It's under hemodynamic, except instead of peak, we're now going to say QRS onset, release, so that's selected. I'm going to click on my event flag so it's there, and I'm going to put Q right there. So it's sort of, sometimes, ideally, there will be actually a dip, kind of like this, right before the R spike goes up. But if it doesn't exist, then you want to kind of get it right in the elbow. This goes the same for the B when you can't get it. But basically, I tried to select the point that if you think of my arm as mimicking the waveform of the ECG here, kind of like this, I'd want to put Q right in where the crook of my elbow would be. And that applies there, and it will apply when B isn't as nice as it is here. So QRS onset is labeled. Now I'm ready to label things in my impedance waveform. So I'm going to go back to the event flag. It's still under hemodynamic, which all refers to essentially like blood stuff, which means heart stuff. So we go to hemodynamic, but now instead of ECG complexes, I'm going to go down to impedance. And we want to choose this B point, which just to psychophysiologists means the point when the left ventricular valve opens. And I've selected that, and now, as I said, it's the local minimum right before the waveform begins to rise to the peak, and you want to put it exactly in the middle of the wave of that dip as much as possible. So I do, and that's where I'd put it. And then I'm going to finally go back to select my X point. So I go to hemodynamic, impedance, X point, and it's going to be this last local minimum. So I'm going to put it right there in the middle, and there we have it. So now you've scored this minute essentially, and we just need to use find cycles in order to translate those into numbers once again. So, sorry, there's one thing I should have showed you before and I didn't. When you start to score impedance, and this says so in your manual, you actually are going to create your own Excel worksheet to start it off. So you're going to put something that says minute, PEP, and LVET. So the minute refers to what minute you're scoring. And you're going to essentially enter these values somewhat manually for every minute. There's a few things to say. Actually, no, I won't get into that yet. So we're going to first try to extract the PEP and LVET values that should go into those other two columns in your spreadsheet. So we're going to go to Analysis, Find Cycle. You'll use it a lot. And now what we want is to locate cycles from events. It's going to ask you about using non-zero offsets and check the default, which is reset offsets to 0, because otherwise it'll yell at you every time. Then for your start event, first we're going to find PEP. Now PEP, as I said, is the time between when your heart beats electrically and when the left ventricular valve actually ejects blood into the body. So since B reflects when the left ventricular valve opens and Q reflects the QRS onset, then simply the millisecond time difference between QRS onset and B is pre-ejection period. So here we want to select that the start event that we want it to find is the QRS onset, and the end event that we want it to find is B, when the left ventricular valve opens. So choose start event, hemodynamic, ECG complexes, QRS onset, and end event, hemodynamic, impedance, and then B point. So once we have that, make sure the selection thing isn't all crazy. And then it's probably easiest to say output save measurements to Excel. But as it'll say in your manual, make sure that this construct an average from blah, blah, blah is unchecked, because otherwise it will yell at you, and for some reason it always checks that by default when you're doing it this way. And yeah, everything else should be good if you keep it at its default, except as it says in the manual, make sure save measurements into Excel is presented. Then it asks you if you want to find all cycles now. You say yes, it finds it, and it spits out something here in your into your data file, into an Excel file, and this value, except multiplied by -1, is your PEP value for that minute. So you'll multiply this value by -1 and put it in that spreadsheet that you had created. So it was 110, or it was -110, so now it's 110, and we have PEP. So then you go back and do essentially the same thing for LVET. Yes? It says it again? Yeah. So again, I would double check what is, you all got it. So you, by any chance, actually, if you do Control Y on your, yeah, exactly. Oh, I think, what is going on? I don't see any of your stuff. Oh yeah, okay, for some reason it's happy now. So yeah, if you click, had you clicked on the graph before when you tried it? Yeah, sorry, click before the first cycle kind of thing, or just anywhere on the graph with your bar cursor. That might be the difference. And now if you do analysis, find all cycles, because it would remember your last default things. Okay, now it's happy. So yeah, I'm not sure if, it should say it in the manual, although I'll double check. But you always, with find cycles, you have to put this cursor before the cycle that you want it to find, or else it'll be like, I can't find any cycles. You're like, but I see them. And that's the way that works. So now for LVET, LVET stands for left ventricular ejection time, which basically means how long is your left ventricle of your heart ejecting blood, literally in time. So, since B is when your left ventricular valve opens, and X is when your left ventricular valve closes, then the time difference between B and X is the amount of time that it was ejecting blood, left ventricular ejection time. It's LVET. So, as you probably are figuring out by now, you'll go to find cycle, and now and we still want events, but now our start event is going to be the B point, and our end event is going to be under the impedance X point. And then just double checking it doesn't mess with us. This averaging, good, it's happy now. And then you click OK. Should say the same thing. And it's going to pop up another temp file. And now when you look in your delta T column, again, it's multiplied by -1, but 282 is the number that you should record for LVET. Now that you've found PEP and LVET for this minute, there's one more thing you need to do, other than, of course, saving your work when you're all done, but one more thing you need to do before you can move on to the next minute. And that's that you need to make sure that the data is physiologically plausible. Now, what that means is that it means that the values that you've extracted from your data could actually come from a human being. Because a lot of times you'll find that actually you get values that couldn't come from a human who is alive. And since no one has ever died in my lab, then that means that you just need to rescore the data in some way. So how do you know whether or not your data is plausible? Well, in the manual, actually let me pull up impedance scoring manual. Yeah. In the manual, towards the end for impedance scoring, you'll see this physiological plausibility table. And this is, the gold standard, and you should make sure that it always conforms. And really, you'll use this in order to fine-tune your scoring and become a better scorer. So you always have to start with heart rate. And you might say, but I don't know what my heart rate is, or the heart rate for this person is. But luckily, when you constructed your average, the acknowledge just automatically says how many cycles it averaged together, and the number of cycles are the number of beats of the heart in that minute. So that's your heart rate. So it says 64 cycles. So in the first minute, there's 64 beats of the heart. Therefore, yes, so 64, we would go then to the middle row here, or sorry, the second row, not the middle row. And you see heart rate is between 60 to 80. So this is what we're looking for. Then you see PEP values are between 132.8 and 73.2. I will say the reason why the boundaries are changing is because as heart rate goes up, PEP and LVET go down. So that's why these are kind of flipped in that way. But our PEP must be in between here. Now, if we remember, our PEP was 110, so we're good to go with that. That's plausible. LVET has to be between 257 and 331, essentially, and I believe it was 282. Indeed. So therefore, we're happy. That's good data. You're ready to move on to the next segment. It always is helpful, once again, to save your work once you've done it. For this minute, and you'd say something. I actually forget exactly what. All right, I should say. Save that minute. File saved. Save the work for that ensembled minute. You could say ensembled. And then you're good to go, and you would move on to the next minute of impedance scoring. All right. I have only about 7 minutes left, I realize, and I don't want to keep you beyond that, but I am going to start with a brief introduction to RSA scoring, which actually is pretty straightforward relatively. With these, again, it's easiest to start with your scored segment here. So you would start with your 1 minute data file. Now for RSA, you don't need your DZDT line anymore, but you do need now this weird Z0 line. Now what you're going to do is translate, or really transform, this waveform into a respiration waveform. So the way that you do it is by selecting your Z0 channel, duplicating this waveform just so that you don't overwrite any data, basically. So up in the Edit menu, we have Duplicate Waveform, and now it just creates a copy. And you want to rename this channel to be Respiration. And I got this little box where it's letting me edit the label just by double-clicking right on this little channel label here. And so call it RESP for respiration. It's just the abbreviation we give for respiration. And now you can hide your original Z0 line if you want. So okay, we have obviously something else we have to do before we turn this into respiration. So now is where you're going to apply a filter. So there are two main filters that we use a lot in physio. There are low-pass filters and high-pass filters. What a filter is going to do is it's going to filter out any noise that has a certain period. Now, as in a very fast waveform that repeats frequently will have a much higher frequency or hertz rate, and very low frequency waveforms will have lower hertz or a lower rate. So the raw impedance measure has all sorts of waveforms that are contributing to it. However, if we filter out every waveform that is, or every period that is contributing to this complex wave that is above 0.5 hertz, then the only thing left in the Z0 band is respiration. So we want to use then, we want to cut off every part of this waveform that is more frequent than 0.5 hertz. And hertz is the number of cycles a second. So this would be half a cycle in a second. So in order to cut off everything above that, we want to use what's called a low-pass filter. What that refers to is there is a threshold, and then it will allow everything below that threshold to pass through, so to still exist. With a high-pass filter, it'll do the opposite. It'll cut out everything that's less frequent and only allow the more higher frequency things through. Now we want to let only the lower frequency things through. So we go to Transform, Digital Filters, and we'll just use the fixed digital filter, and we use low pass because we want everything below 0.5 to come through. Most of these defaults you can just keep, but you'll click Fixed as your frequency cutoff and choose 0.5, which is just what we know works for respiration. You do want to make sure that this box is checked, and most likely it will be. The only time it wouldn't be would be if you actually had some of your graphs selected, and then it would only want to do it there, and you just need to make sure that was checked. But this says filter entire waveform because we want it to transform the whole wave. So now, click OK, and now we see what looks much more like a respiration waveform. So every time you see a dip, that means it's the end of an exhalation, and if it starts to rise right after that, it means they're starting to inhale here. And when it gets to the top, they're done inhaling and they're starting to breathe out, and this goes down to the bottom. So this is the blood, or the volume of air that is currently in people's lungs. And the way we're getting that is when we're measuring impedance. We actually have these electrode bands around their torso right here. So if you breathe in, your chest expands, and when you breathe out, your chest comes in, and that's how we measured it. So from there, we do this pass for respiration, where we go down to hemodynamics, respiratory sinus arrhythmia. It asks what channel contains your ECG signal. You select the ECG one. Then it says what channel contains the respiration signal. Acknowledges doesn't know, so you have to select the one that you just created that you called RESP, and then click OK. And it's going to think about all sorts of stuff for a while, and then it didn't really detect very many at all. Okay, so with this then, you're then going to focus on your respiration waveform, and Notice it only really found one of them. Okay, so in Acknowledge, what it's doing is it's adding, it's automatically adding these little noses where you see an arrow going up into it. It means it's an inhalation, and a little nose where it's coming down, it means exhale. And you're gonna go through this waveform, which I won't do now because I want to let you guys go. But you'll go through, and at every peak, you'll insert an exhalation, because that's when people are starting to exhale. And at every dip, you'll insert a little event marker that is inhalation, and they'll look like these noses. And then after you've done that for the whole wave, then you'll run that same analysis again, and what gets put out in that Excel file, you'll save for that minute, very similarly to how we did for impedance. But I think we'll need to focus on that later. Most of what we're interested in, first of all, is getting you guys started with ECG and impedance. And I think that will be enough just for the very beginning. And then we'll coordinate a way. Julian will email you about this, and we'll coordinate about this. So I want you guys to start by scoring 3 files, and then you'll upload them to a centralized place, probably Dropbox. And then I'll go through and evaluate the scoring. And the purpose of that is, don't be like, oh my God, evaluation. That's just because, the first time you pass through, I'm sure there's, things that I'll say, well, you're putting B a little bit too far to the left, like systematically, right? So then I'll tell you about that, and then you can adjust your scoring, and then that way we pretty quickly will get to good quality control, and then we'll revisit RSA at a later date. But just to get you started, that was what that was about. So yeah, do you have any questions about this stuff at this point? Cool. Once you get into it, then also a lot of things will come up, as well as, I think it's kind of fun to score data, but maybe that's also cognitive dissonance because I've scored thousands of hours of data in my lifetime. But yeah, I hope you find it fun too, and I'm really happy to welcome you to the lab as well. So thank you.